Hello, I'm Mr. Steinhauer, and this is 3rd and 4th grade science. Today, we'll be talking about friction and different surfaces, and how the friction of different surfaces affects the motion of an object. At the end of the lesson, I'm going to show you what you'll need to do to replicate or redo the activity that we will do today. As always, let's start by thinking about the vocabulary, the important words and concepts that we'll use during this lesson. Friction is a push force that opposes another force. Today, we're going to use different surfaces and different kinds of materials to move along those surfaces, and we're going to compare how friction affects their motion. So we'll be looking at how that motion might change. Some ways that motion could change would be if we added or reduced speed, or if the object changed direction, changed which way it was going. So let's look at the materials that I have, and then let's see what happens on these different surfaces. Here are the materials that I'm using. I just went around my home and found what I had. You will do the same at the end of the lesson. But for now, let's take a look at what I have. I've got a remote control with big buttons and an empty roll of toilet paper. So that toilet paper roll and the remote control with those big buttons are going to be the two objects that I put into motion using some force of my own. The different surfaces that we will try are these right here. There's one that looks kind of like a whiteboard kind of surface, very, very smooth. Then we have a wood surface that's also smooth. And finally, a towel. Which one of these three surfaces do you think has the most friction? Which object do you think has the most friction of the two of these? Finally, which surface do you think has the least amount of friction force? Well, let's find out. I have two objects that I'm going to roll down my ramp here, and then I've got my two surfaces that I'm actually going to put on top of this. Now, my two objects first. My remote control, here's what it looks like, spin it around, and my toilet paper roll. Which one of these is going to have more friction force on its surface? That's right, the remote control will have the most friction force. And that's because of the bumpiness of all those buttons. And then also, while the other side is smooth, you can see it's almost like the heel of a shoe, right? So it's got kind of a bump here on the back where those batteries get put in. So on either side of my remote, it's a little more bumpy. You'll have a little more friction force than on the smooth outside of a toilet paper roll, which is also round, which we already know is going to roll quite well. So the first surface that I'm going to test is the towel. Now, I like to use things that I can find really easily in my home. I like for you to be able to use objects that you can find easily at home as well. So think to yourself about the surface of a towel. How would you describe the surface of a towel? I would say that it's a little bumpy, maybe rough, certainly more rough than just the wood on its own. So maybe you might not have access to a towel like this. Maybe you have access to something else that has a similar texture, because that's going to have a similar friction force as well. Now let's roll our two objects and see which one rolls faster. I'm actually going to adjust my towel here so that I make sure it clings to the back and it doesn't move. So that is being held together by friction force and by gravity pushing down on the couch. All right, taking my two objects. Which one is going to roll faster? Let's find out. Now I could say let's test that again, but it's pretty clear which one of these has more friction. The friction of the remote control of those button sides and the friction on the surface of the towel made it so that the remote control didn't even move. There's enough friction force coming from the towel and from the remote control that those forces are both pushing against gravity pulling this down the ramp. We already saw how this is a ramp here and a pretty steep one. Look how this rolls pretty quickly. And the toilet paper roll, of course, wasn't really affected as much at all by the towel here. Now, a way that will really show the difference in friction force on different surfaces will be if we use a second surface here. So a reminder here, I am using two surfaces, but I also have one material that serves as my ramp. So I can just put these surfaces right back on here. And then they'll stay. Again, we have our remote control and our toilet paper roll. Which one is going to roll faster? And why is that? Well, let's put them to the test. 3, 2, 1. Now this is a much smoother surface. This feels just like a whiteboard at school does. But even then, the remote control is moving very, very slowly. As it turns, it's getting pulled down, and there's still a friction force that's pushing against that pull force of gravity. If I adjust the shape of my remote control, you might think there's less friction force from this angle, or rather there's less friction force here than there would be here. But either way, there's enough friction force that the remote control is not just going to slide down like if I put it on its backside. It will slide right down. So one side of the remote has way less friction than the other, and that is because of its surface. So when an object is in motion, we talked about in a previous class how that object will stay in motion unless another force acts on it. This remote control will stay in motion unless there's enough friction to keep it from moving. And it will also stay at rest until another force makes it move. And the force of gravity in this case is not very powerful compared to the friction force on the surface of the remote. Now thinking about our toilet paper roll again, either surface, it's going to roll pretty quickly. But it rolls much quicker on, it rolls much quicker on the surface with less friction than it does, say, on the towel. Not so fast there. Versus very fast here. So friction, even with an object or a surface that doesn't have a lot of friction, friction still is a force that plays a role. Now it's your turn. You're going to recreate this demonstration of friction's effects on different surfaces from your home. Find a very smooth surface, a more rough surface, and find two different objects with different surfaces of their own. Compare the effect of friction on the objects as they move, and share that with a loved one. You may even go the extra step of finding some sort of material to use as your ramp. But of course, this would also work just on the floor. You'd have to give it a little more push to see really how friction will affect it though. That's the only difference. Until next time, my friends, it's been my pleasure as always having you in class. My name's Mr. Steinauer, and I'll see you next week.